Up next on the schedule, we have the big question of the conference, which is how can UN Tax Convention address inequality in Europe and beyond? And I'd like to invite to the stage Tove Maria Ryding from Eurodad and from Global Alliance for Tax Justice, Dereje Alemayehu. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. It will give me a wrong image if I sit there. I'm not going to lecture. You know, I'm an African, so we are storytellers, so I'm going to tell you stories. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and we are very happy to be part of this. I will start with a bit of story of how the Global Alliance was created. And then I will reverse roles and start telling you what Europe should do. We have been used to be told what to do as Africans, but I will reverse it today. The Global Alliance for Tax Justice was created about now almost 11 years ago. We're together with Tax Justice Network. But at that time, basically, the Tax Justice Network was more of a research and experts group, mostly representing northern institutions and northern setups. So it was then decided to have a global umbrella network in which the southern continents and members will have their own voice and their own representatives. So that is why we call ourselves Southern-led Global Coalition. We have tax justice networks continentally, TAFJA in Asia, Red Justicia Fiscal in Latin America, Tax Justice Europe, North America, and Tax Justice Network Africa. These are the 5 constituent regional members. They bring together the tax justice country level, regional level initiatives and social movements. And they create a board consisting of 10 members, 2 from each continent. So it is an attempt to give the platform and the opportunity for those who are responsible to lead their changes in their continents to be also the speakers on their own behalf on the global stage. So we have been, it was not an easy start. It was the first type of structure, but we have gone, I hope, and that I think we have gone far to the extent of being at one point nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So here we are, and then we're also among, since 2015, we have been pushing for a UN tax convention to bring international tax rulemaking and standard setting from the OECD, the Club of the Rich, back to the United Nations, and we have achieved some success in this area. So this is about the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and what we stand for. Then, so in coming to the second one, what do I want Europeans to do? The first thing is really to do your own homework. When in the 19th century, when the first international was created, Germans felt they are more civilized, so they will go and liberate the rest of Europe, especially Central and Eastern European countries. And Karl Marx asked them to put a sentence in the first clause, which says, each proletariat has to settle accounts with its own bourgeoisie. So the best thing that Europe can do is do its own homework and do away with the wrong things that are happening in Europe itself. Gabriel, I've heard you say on TV in France that France is a tax haven for French billionaires. I was recently listening to a podcast from Eva Joly on La Veille Branche, all the saga about what she did against ELF. And I was, Eva, by the way, very interested to hear that you were the most protected person during in France when you were doing this job. So it shows how hard it is even in France to go against multinational companies. So what I'm saying is, if Europe can take care of its multinationals, it is the biggest relief to the rest of the world. I don't think that, in America they say, what is good for General Motors is good for America. I don't think so. What's good for Total is not good for France. And the second one is, your politicians send themselves to be liberators of other countries. I remember, you remember Joschka Fischer, the German foreign minister? He was a very decent human being when he was a taxi driver, but later on. And then at any rate, he was saying, he was in Africa, talking to African foreign ministers, saying, help me to help Africa. But when he was saying this, German multinationals could deduct their alleged corruption money they paid in Africa from their tax returns. And then Alain Badiou calls him Napoleon le Plus Petit, you know to whom I'm referring. He is now starting one initiative against the other, but he is not doing anything to improve. Bruno Le Maire, the finance minister, as recently as 2 years ago, saying there is no such a concept like extra profit. So if these things are there, it is not possible for them to intervene positively internationally. So the first assignment for Europe would be to do its homework, rein in their own multinationals who are creating havoc, bring in fair tax systems in our countries, then they will be very well equipped to also contribute positively to the rest of the global problems. Then the second in the international scene is really the role Europe is playing. You know, when Macron says, I have started an initiative to fund climate justice and what? It is a duplication. It is a distraction from the major tasks that are taking place within the UN. What is the role of France in there? What is the role of Germany? What is the role of, if it is about you trying to prevent their blockage tactics in these spaces? Yesterday, Eva was also saying what achievement was done at the level of the European Parliament. And it went to the other side of the street and it was blocked by the European Commission. As long as such structures continue, the contribution of Europe to improve the international situation will not be good. So the first is to fight for tax justice in your respective countries and force your government to rein in their multinationals, which are really causing havoc. And the second one is to be part of a change process globally instead of being blockers. So that is what we are standing for with Tax Justice Europe together. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dereje, and good morning, everyone. In the train on the way here, I realized that I think you and I must have passed our 10-year working together sometime last year. So I first wanted to say it's been an absolute pleasure and really an inspiration and a fantastic time to see the Global Alliance grow. And I think one of the many qualities of the Global Alliance is that the saying that we should have Southern leadership, it went from being nice words to actually being an example for the world. And I think in many ways, the Global Alliance structure and ways of working are quite unique, but I think it really is an important example of how things can be done. And yes, my name is Tove Ryding. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Eurodad. And I also have the pleasure of being one of 2 European representatives in the coordinating committee of the Global Alliance. And indeed, I think one of the issues that we have spent so much time on over the last years has been the idea of having an intergovernmental UN tax process and a UN tax convention. And like we said in New York, when suddenly we had the first day of the intergovernmental UN tax negotiations, we said, if only we had a tax dollar for every time we were told this day would never come. It was a bit surreal. Now they started talking. We're not at the point where we actually have a tax convention, but I think the change that has happened is absolutely enormous. And that's the second round of important acknowledgement that I want to open with is we have a lot of people in this room that have worked tremendously hard for this push to have global level change, but also to promote tax justice in Europe. Many civil society and trade union colleagues here. We also have many around the world. And so what we're seeing is change can happen. We can really make progress if we work together. But I could agree more with Dereje that I think our sometimes quite tedious job is to try and get Europe to perform well. And it was the latest time was this week. I was in Brussels and the issue came up about, oh, developing countries are losing tax money. And there was a high-level civil servant in the room who wasn't used to discussing illicit financial flows. And the gut reaction was, yeah, they don't have capacity, those developing countries. And that's why they're losing tax money. And here I always love to quote a very dear colleague of ours, Pujaranga Prasad. I think she really says it great whenever she hears this. She looks at whichever European official or government has told her that she needs capacity building. And she says, we look at your countries and we see that multinational corporations aren't paying tax in your countries either. Your wealthy aren't paying taxes. What capacity is it that you're suggesting to transfer to my country, if I may ask? And I think this really sums up the challenge we have is that in our minds, we are still progressive countries. We still have progressive tax systems. I'm Scandinavian. We've almost made it a brand to make the world believe that we are really progressive. But if we look at what actually happened in Europe, there's been a change over the last decades that is very, very different from the Europeans we like to think that we are. And last year, the European Commission launched a report about the state of tax in Europe. And it's actually quite blunt on the fact that the reason why there's been a dismantling of wealth taxes in Europe, a large reason for that is we call it international tax cooperation, which is international tax competition, which is a nice word for a complete collapse in intergovernmental cooperation. They're undermining each other. They are being the lowest bidders. They're driving themselves to the bottom. And this has caused us to start dismantling a very important progressive tax. Exactly the same picture on taxation of multinational corporations. They're being driven against each other, they're competing, and we can see that the global average corporate tax rate has skyrocketed since the 80s, and Europe has very much been in the lead of that. In fact, we did a calculation some years ago showing that at the current rate, the global average corporate tax rate is going to hit 0 in the year 2052. And I think that's one question that I want to bring to the Europeans as we discuss what can be done on tax. We have estimates for how much is lost in corporate tax income due to tax avoidance. We have some estimates for tax evasion. So we're looking at what can be done if we stop the illicit financial flows. And the first point to know for Europe is that this is not just a developing country issue. We are losing a fortune. Actually, as developed countries, in absolute numbers, we are losing the most. So the first thing is that we have a strong economic incentive to come to the table and try and solve that. But I haven't yet seen a projection for what would happen if we started racing to the top again. If we started reversing the downward trend in our progressive tax rate, our corporate income tax rate, our wealth taxes, bringing them back, if we started taxing the large corporations and wealthy people like we used to, what would happen to the public coffers in Europe? This would be massive. And it would not only mean that we don't have to go through austerity and cutting healthcare ourselves, it would also mean that we become a bit more the Europeans that I think many of us still are in our heads. We still think that we are progressive countries, but we are really not. This is to say that Europe has a lot to gain from global tax cooperation and from a UN tax convention. And it is with a quite big heartbreak that you sit at the UN and the issue of having a UN convention on tax comes up in November, and you see your entire region, all of the EU countries, including my country, Denmark, voting no, let's not do that. And we all know that there's politics going on. They want it to be at the OECD instead of the UN and so forth, but we also have to reflect on 50 years of failure. The OECD has been in charge for 50 years. The Global Tax Corporation has been non-existent. And whatever you might think of the OECD outcomes, there is no doubt that a lot more remains to be done. The UN track is now the only track in town, and it's a huge opportunity to make more progress. How can we vote no to that? We were very happy to see in February, however, that the EU countries came back to the table. In fact, all countries came to the table, and we had the first negotiations in New York. And finally, they reached an agreement on a roadmap moving forward. So right now, all countries are on board and at the table and negotiating. And then comes the question, and this is the interesting one, negotiating what? There's the predecessor of the UN, the League of Nations, over 100 years ago. They weren't discussing climate change or development or so forth. They were discussing tax, however. This UN tax convention has literally been 100 years in the making. For political reasons, tax was moved to the OECD when more and more countries became independent. But now it's coming back. And we are the lucky generation of people that get to not only discuss whether there should be a UN convention on tax, we get to discuss what it should look like. What should be in this convention? And actually, the debate is moving quite fast at the moment. It's a blank piece of paper. They're supposed to have something on paper by the end of August this year. It couldn't be a more perfect time to have a conference like this and really discuss, okay, great, fixing the global tax system, tax justice. What does it look like? What does this convention really look like? And of course, 2 years ago, we launched a 50-page proposal for what a UN convention on tax could look like. We actually didn't really dare to call it a proposal, so we called it a discussion paper because we thought, boy, this is a lot, and we were quite specific. And still 2 years down the road, surprisingly, a lot of support from many different types of actors, and there are even some European governments that start saying actually a more coherent system might make some things easier, even for business. But of course, we have a specific proposal for what a UN convention should look like. But we want more debate, and now is the time to have the debate. And this year, there will be a number of decisions made. The first decision is, are they actually going to cooperate? In December, they reached a consensus agreement. We were actually positively shocked. The United States was in the room, the EU, everyone reached a consensus agreement on how to discuss. They haven't actually gotten into substance. They're going to get into substance in April. If this breaks down, it is going to be full drama because this is extremely political, and sometimes breaking down the negotiations can be part of the tactic. But if the negotiations break down, we need to be ready to remind everyone that processes don't just break down on their own. Just like if your marriage fails, you can't say, I had nothing to do with it. Governments are at the table negotiating. If it breaks down, it's because governments weren't cooperating well enough. And we need to hold people accountable if the negotiations break down. But that's the first issue we have to watch. The second one is the overall level of ambition. Are they actually going to commit to try and change something? And there's also a huge job to do. But the third question, and this one is really important, is what is this convention about? It's clear we'll have something on illicit flows. There's going to be something on corporate tax, but you can imagine very light touch agreements and very, very top level documents that don't change much. And then you can imagine a much more solid and strong framework. And I think this is where we have a key role in creating some dreams and ambitions. For example, the issue of progressive tax systems. Is this going to be in the convention? We have a UN commitment from 2015 to promote progressive tax systems, but that doesn't mean it goes into the UN convention on its own. Having this in the convention will be extremely important for whether we can discuss things like wealth taxes. So one of the important proposals is when we discuss the objective of this convention, let's make sure that that objective captures progressive tax systems and captures the elements relating to inequality and what the purpose of tax systems are. On the purpose, we also don't have much on tax systems being in accordance with human rights, gender equality, reducing inequalities. All the different goals that are out there are not necessarily linked yet to the UN Convention. So there's a big job this year in making sure that the scope and the objective and the whole exercise goes off in a direction where the things that we want to see covered will be covered. Relating to that, there's an emerging issue which I think is extremely important, and I saw my colleague Marcus just walked in the door. The issue of tax and environment is really up and coming. There's growing debates about this in all levels, and we see on both sides suddenly there's a lot of interest in this issue. There are some regressive taxes that are being sold as environmental measures, and one suspicion we have is that maybe value-added tax became unpopular, so we rename it carbon tax, but it's really the same kind of exercise, and we try to get more money from the same people as we're hit hard by the other regressive consumption taxes. That's one trend that's going on. But we also have things like windfall profit taxes on fossil fuel corporations suddenly. Very interesting ideas that are very progressive, but they're also introduced in a very light touch and timid way at the moment. We have an initiative at the EU, but it's temporary, it's not very strong, but it shows it can be done. And so this issue of tax and environment, this is one to watch. And we've seen also this country, I couldn't agree more with all of Macron's different initiatives. And one of the interesting things we saw last year is that while France was arguing you don't discuss tax at the UN, has to be discussed at the OECD in Paris, we also saw Macron and his team using the climate COP to talk about the need for a global tax on environment and climate and so forth. And the excellent question is great. Where are you going to do that? What is your instrument to actually do this? So obviously now we have that instrument taking form, and we need to make sure that the issue of tax and environment is incorporated. Right now, it's not there. We need to put it in this year. But we also need to make sure that it's linked to the overall idea of reducing inequalities and having progressive tax systems. So these are some of the very, very exciting things that are coming up this year. And this will be my cross-cutting question to all the speakers and debates this week is, how are you going to do that? What does it look like? Wealth tax at the global level, wealth tax at the national level. What does it look like? How exactly what words do we need to get into the UN negotiations this year? Tax and environment, how are you going to do that? How does it look like? New corporate tax system, I think we have a sense that this one is pretty big. And so one suggestion we have is incorporate the primary elements, the overall structure, outline what exactly is it you want, but then because of the way that the negotiations are happening, what they're negotiating is a framework convention. And that means you can put in the overall structures, And then you can do a protocol later on, just like the climate negotiations have a convention and Kyoto Protocol and so forth. So put in the overall structures and then have a protocol process to hash out the details of the system. That's our suggestion, to avoid that this becomes a multi-year exercise of discussing just one issue that's getting everything stuck. Nonetheless, if we miss the boat now and we don't get the overall structures into the text, then it's going to be difficult to introduce it later. The process this year is that now we have the roadmap from February, and then we are all meeting together at the end of April and going into May for 9 negotiating days. There, they're going to start discussing the terms of reference for a framework convention on tax. This negotiation right now, it really is a blank piece of paper. There is a deadline for making submissions to this. Everyone's invited and everyone can submit their inputs by Friday. And civil society, if you haven't signed the draft joint submission, please do. The deadline is 10 a.m. tomorrow. And this is going to be from governments and from all sorts of actors. We'll get inputs. We'll get a first draft of the terms of reference. Then the negotiations reconvene at the end of July. And there we have 3 weeks of intergovernmental UN negotiations. That is a lot. And there they will go into the nitty-gritty to try and reach a global agreement on the terms of reference for a framework convention on tax. That then goes back to the General Assembly, and then the idea would be to start the negotiations next year if all goes well, and if our governments behave. So if we miss this year, we don't get into the terms of reference, it's not like we can never catch up, but it's going to be a lot easier if our ideas are in the terms of reference for the convention already this year. And I think this will be my closing remark is, please don't think that we have decades to get this done. We've heard a lot. We've heard so many times that you'll never get this intergovernmental UN tax negotiation, and you'll never get the UN tax convention. We even had last year, there were some people telling us we'd never get the intergovernmental UN tax negotiation, and we had to tell them it was just decided. We got it. It's coming. But right now, it is a quite speedy process. The proposal from the Africa group last year was to have the full convention done by June 2025. There, even we were a bit like, maybe give ourselves a little bit longer. But this is a very fast-moving process. And right now, we have a political momentum where I think we have to admit that even us, the happy, naive people, were a bit positively shocked about what happened. So now is really the time for us to get into the debate and to be concrete and to really look at the substance. It's such an exciting time. It's time to answer the question, what should a UN framework convention on tax look like? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dereje and Tove, for setting the scene for the next 2 days, and both presenting a bit the history, introducing the history of the tax justice movement, and also stressing the steps ahead. So I hope that everyone found it inspirational, and I hope I gave you the energy for for the next few months and years ahead. We have about 15 minutes left now before the break for question and answers. So we have 2 people floating in the amphitheater, and I'll ask people to raise their hand. And I think we'll take 2 questions at the same time. Don't be shy.
Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. One key issue is the development of protocols that will go in the convention, and I think there's a lot of people saying that this year we should just focus on getting the terms of reference correct, or there's other people that say that we should do get the protocol started, and so there is a commitment to develop those protocols. Where do you see the balance, and where do you think are the potential challenges?
I'm happy to give that one a go. Yes, there is a wording in the resolution that is the mandate for the negotiations, the one that was adopted in November last year, that says early protocols could be negotiated simultaneously. And as I understand it, there is a bit of a reconsideration about how that would work. I think the underlying issue is that a framework convention can be many things. A framework convention can be a complete skeleton where you set up a conference of the parties, and you say, this thing can make more decisions, but we're not going to make any decisions now. You can have a complete skeleton framework convention. We don't have many of those. Most framework conventions go much more into substance. If you read the Climate Convention or the Biodiversity Convention, the WHO Tobacco Control Convention, they all have much more substance. And that's a good thing because it describes the overall objectives, principles, and also some key decisions on how institutions are going to work, how commitments are going to work. And so it fleshes out what the issue is in a way that doesn't close the door to further decisions, but it just frames the issue. So the discussion about protocols, I think, is linked to this, because if you imagine we have a complete skeleton and then we put all the substance in protocols, you risk that some countries sign on to the skeleton, but they don't sign on to the protocol. And this is very much a risk with protocols, is that you could actually end up with a fraction system. We want coherence, but you could end up with seeing it splitting apart. So what we're saying is negotiate now, start the negotiation, get as far as you can, make sure that you capture all the key overall titles and headlines and concepts. Get as far as you can, and then you close the deal, and then you put in the deal that you will negotiate protocols on the priority issues that you were not able to conclude. And there are already examples of that. You have in the Biodiversity Convention, you have a mandate to negotiate a protocol right after they finished the Framework Convention. So that's the suggestion of how we do it. Instead of having simultaneous negotiations, you do the convention relatively quickly, and then you do the protocols as the next step, is the suggestion.
For me, the agreement to do the terms of reference with a simple majority instead of consensus in what was a big achievement, because what the OECD side was trying to do was to block progress, because if it is only unanimous, then you cannot put into things that are more comprehensive, that are more structural, because the OECD countries have not yet given up on the ambition of being the rule makers. So to leave, actually, what will now the battle for the terms of reference would be for OECD countries to say, leave corporate income tax, leave other institutional arrangements to the OECD. OECD has the technical capacity to do it, and then leave the UN with blah blah, platitudinous principal issues and what. So that is why I'm always worried when the Pillar 1 is described as the beginning of unitary taxation, or when the minimum tax is taken as the beginning of the end of tax competition. I'm worried about that, because that is exactly what it is. We are on the way to finish it, so the UN should not mess up things now. That is what the argument being prepared. So that is why I have always my worries about, if you take the Pillar 1, to reduce it to 100 multinational companies, and to go only for 10% of that, it is not even a beginning. You know, if I have a wound which comes from here up to here, if you give me a plaster that covers this heart, you are not curing my wound. So it is not the way things should. It's not the way things should start. So at any rate, the issue Tove mentioned earlier, the fact of being ambitious about the convention's content itself is very important. And the others are derived functions, really. And the fact of agreeing to bring back international tax cooperation, rulemaking, and standard setting from a club of rich institution to a universal membership institution. These are the issues which are at stake. And that is where the role of Europe should be defined. Is it to block multilateralism in its true sense, or is it continuing to dominate in the interest of It is not in the interest of European citizens. It is in the interest of European multinationals or American multinationals. So that is, I think, the key issue is to be ambitious about the terms of reference itself, and then make sure that the scope and the principles are as universal, as comprehensive as possible.
So I think there's one more question, and don't hesitate to introduce yourself, because we're going to spend time together in the next days. So it's also good that we can identify each other.
Okay. Hi, good morning. My name is Severine, and I'm one of several trade unionists here in the room. Thank you so much for this great introduction. I had a question, but Dereje, I'm afraid you've half responded to it already, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. In Europe, we often hear the argument that to have international tax architecture under the UN auspices will create risk of duplication with what the OECD is doing today. So in fact, it's the main argument that we hear against the UN Convention. So could you tell us your views on that? Although you already did, but perhaps you want to do it again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for interesting keynotes. My name is Anne Marte from Norwegian Church Aid. And as you said, like, it's a risk that the European countries are not as progressive as we want them to be. And in order to make sure that they are, we need strong campaigns in the countries in Europe. And I just wanted to ask if you can say something about the situation, the civil society in Europe on tax, and what we can do to strengthen the civil society.
Last question.
Thank you so much. I'm Emilia Reyes. I'm with the feminist Mexican organization Equidad, Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo, Familia. I'm very interested in the topic on how the UN Treaty can be addressed from the European point of view, because actually what is being said from European organizations is that they're very technical, that they work politically, whatever, and then they expect the Global South to do all of the work. We've seen that in many occasions, in many UN negotiations, they always come to us and add the burden on us to say, you have to mobilize the G77 because our governments are crap. But they are giving us the money, and they will. We cannot face, we cannot confront them because they're giving us the money, or they're not going to meet with us again. So we are the ones who are putting the body, putting the disappear, the torture, the people, the impacts, and we are the ones who are actually also promoting transformations on the ground, and we are moving our governments to have the most progressive positions, where we are the ones who are bearing the impacts of the criminality of the actions of the global north. So in this moment that is so key, as both of you have highlighted, what is the strategy, not only led by you, by this room entirely, into mobilizing in a political manner, and not the pretension that is just a technical discussion, to mobilize the criminality of the actions of the global north at this moment? Thank you.
Thank you. These issues are more interesting as a group discussion than me being an authority to reply to them. But about duplication, the first thing to ask is what is there, and what is the UN going to duplicate? Take the OECD. Is it the first thing about OECD is it is a club. It is not a universal membership organization. It had no role. It is a role it has usurped. It is not a role that is mandated to do. You cannot who assigned the OECD to do these things? Where is the mandate? So this is the first thing. The institutional legitimacy of OECD is so doubtful that starting this international cooperation discussion at the UN, which with a universal membership, it is a continuation of a work that started 100 years ago. It's not a duplication. The second one is, if you know, they talk about 140 countries. If you look at how this is constituted, in the first place, the UK is represented how many times? Because all its secrecy jurisdictions are full-fledged members of this institution. I was once invited to the Inclusive Framework meeting in the Netherlands. We were allowed to go in, speak, and come out. That was all, not participating. So anyway, and then in front of me was the big Republic of Macau as a member. So this is how it is constituted. The second one is half of African countries are not members in the first place. So the way it is organized, and then inclusive framework was actually an afterthought. The OECD with its members drafted something, and then they said, and then we started a slogan: if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. So then they just said, okay, let's invite. But already the cook is there. And then actually the Netherlands representative said, why should you worry about who cooks it as long as you get to eat? That is how inclusivity is being considered at the OECD. At any rate, and then for me, the most important thing is it has no neutral secretariat. The convener is the manipulative OECD secretariat. So there is no issue which, or there is no institutional setup which is now working that the UN process is going to replace. There are no issues which have been negotiated at an intergovernmental level in a legal framework which are going to be duplicated. So duplication, it is not a duplication, it is an innovation actually. And then about the technical contributions, nobody has said the OECD has no say in that. It is about its claim to lead, not it's about technical knowledge. So the OECD has all the possibility of inputting into the universal process. So it is not about rejecting anything the OECD proposes, it's about not accepting the institutional framework and the claim of legitimacy it has to do things behind the closed door to the exclusion of, and then you know how the decision-making process takes place. Some of the observers have published a lot about that. Or now, for example, just one trick I want to mention that about the two-pillar solution. The OECD is very much in a hurry to get some signatories by June, to say we have done the work. The UN does not need to intervene. But the trick is, it comes to effect after ratification. They are 100% through the UN. The US is not going to ratify. But for now, to say that at the UN it is duplication, don't take up corporate income tax issues into the United Nations. That is what they want to push for a signature, knowing that it will, by bringing the duplication agreement, they will block it from taking place in the UN, but they are not going to deliver it at the OECD either. So the whole duplication argument is an argument to block a global process as in a truly intergovernmental situation.
I'll try to be very quick because I know we need to wrap up. On the civil society mobilization, I think one of the most amazing things we have in the tax movement is very strong and knowledgeable and committed and amazing partners in the global south. And for me, at least, also is one of the most inspiring things about my job. We really get to look at what is change making at the global level and learn from each other. In Europe, amazing network, but also growing rapidly. And I think one of the things we're really seeing is that the tax campaign is the only campaign I've ever heard of that actually generates money. If we win this, we get more money. We're not very clear on what to spend it on, and that gets you a lot of friends. And we're very happy to have our new friends in the environmental movement and public services. And I mean, we need to work with the people that have strong positions on how to spend it. And therein comes a very, very happy marriage. And we can help channel money to some of the areas that are desperately lacking funding. There's many of them, so if I don't mention any, I won't forget any, but there's a lack of money in the world, and we are the campaign that found the money. So there is a huge momentum. But in addition to selling it to our civil society colleagues, we also need to sell it to our EU governments on the duplication. I actually think the fear is that we won't duplicate. We look at Pillar 1 and we go, no, why would we ever duplicate that? They're afraid we're going to negotiate the same issue and reach a different conclusion. And that is something entirely different. And I think they know on the issue of how taxing rights should be divided between countries, there's also huge disagreements within the European Union itself. But the last point about why this will never be duplication is that we have never had a truly global agreement on tax. There never was a global tax system. We have a completely mad network of bilateral tax treaties and different half-signed and implemented multilateral treaties on top of it. We have made a complete mess of the international tax system. It's not about duplicating any of that. Now we're starting to build up something coherent, something strong, something clear, something much more simple, and something that will ultimately be a huge advantage for everyone. Thank you so much.